From its earliest beginnings, television has been the time machine through which we viewed the past. And throughout the ages of television, one subject has had an enduring appeal and surprising fascination: archaeology.
It was just something that made me feel really alive and part of a continuum, and not necessarily this thing called history.
Archaeology has created nationally shared moments and given us much-loved figures. Academics have become celebrities, and celebrities have tried to become archaeologists. The secrets of lost civilizations, buried treasure, and the mysteries of the past have gripped the imagination of generations.
Archaeology is unique, or rather the act of excavation is unique. No one has ever done that before, to expose what's underneath. No one can ever do it again.
Now, new technologies are bringing us ever closer to decoding the secrets of our ancestors.
The past is about people. You know, it's not about the objects, it's not about the monuments, it's actually about people.
To all this, cinema has added glamour and excitement. There's treasure to be found, evil to be fought, and curses to be cursed. But in an age of constant change, can the lure of archaeology continue to captivate new audiences? Is there a future in the past?
We dig, 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 dig from early morn till night. We dig, 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 dig up everything inside.
At the dawn of television history, even quiz programmes came archaeologically shaped.
It's of the Roman period, from Bohemia or thereabouts.
Date?
All right.
Date?
Roman.
Well, I mean, good heavens.
Oh, well, the early centuries A.D. You can't date that poor wretched animal. It might be 2nd, 3rd, or 4th century.
Well, now, 3 experts, only 1 right, 1 mark.
Oh, dear.
This is my new system.
Animal, Vegetable, Mineral also gave one talented young man his first break.
I joined it after the first edition as a trainee producer. Coming from the world of publishing, I had no idea what television was about, but it was absolutely clear to me that it was great fun.
It's a lady
I don't know
pot.
why you're talking about the Navy, but go on.
It's a lady pot.
A lady pot?
It's a pot I should think of the Neolithic period.
Why?
Because it is too bad to be anything else.
Chaired by leading archaeologist Professor Glyn Daniel with guests who were distinguished academics, Animal, Vegetable, Mineral was a panel game where contestants had to guess the provenance of ancient artefacts, a sort of very antique roadshow.
It wasn't a matter of objects necessarily. It was about characters, people whose enthusiasms came across on the screen. They were essentially the leading scholars of their age as well, but they were wildly enthusiastic.
One of the regular guests was the mischievous and rather raffish Sir Mortimer Wheeler. Animal, Vegetable, Mineral made Sir Mortimer into a national institution.
Well, now, of course, all this has nothing to do with merit. This is merely a question of old age. You chose me as your guest. I'm perfectly certain it was a sort of symbol of antiquity.
Mortimer Wheeler was an extraordinary man, and he was a gift to archaeology at a time when archaeology needed charisma. He innovated the entire profession. A lot of people didn't like him, and that was to do with his strength of personality. But a lot of people did like him. He did some spectacular excavations that impressed colleagues.
Behind me you see the floor of one of the wealthier houses of Verulamium. It was probably laid down originally by Roman or Italian craftsmen.
Sir Mortimer was the most famous archaeologist of his day, and one used to being in the media's eye.
Here is another vessel which has come from the well, bearing the inscription Bibe, B-I-B-E, which means, of course, drink. What the drink was, we're not informed.
He also spectacularly impressed the British public. He was a great entertainer. He was a great educator. He enjoyed immensely what he was doing. He believed in it. It fired him with an enormous passion, and he spread that.
Now, here's the next object, which is of stone. And when I saw it again tonight, I knew what it reminded me of. there we are.
As it happens, in 10 days' time, I'm going to show a slide of this in the city of Cheltenham as an illustration of Celtic art. Cheltenham has been warned. And the other thing is this, that this is one of the 2 best examples that I know of illustrations of the way in which an emphatic moustache can redeem a somewhat intractable countenance.
It is an extraordinary thing to say, but the television personality of the year, one year, was Glyn Daniel, the chairman of this quiz, an archaeologist, a Don from Cambridge. And then Mortimer Wheeler became television personality of the year. It's unthinkable now.
With such a hit on its hands, the BBC gave Glyn Daniel and Sir Mortimer a new, more ambitious series, Buried Treasure. The Peat Bog murder mystery told the story of a puzzling death of a Danish peasant in the Bronze Age.
Only the head's been preserved at the National Museum at Copenhagen. The body has been used for examination and analysis. The whole preservative processes took about 14 months. But it's the expression that perhaps is the most remarkable thing about Tolland Man. The humour and the wrinkles at the corner of the eyes and the serenity give a quite extraordinary impression of these early people.
And he looks as if he's separated from us by sleep rather than by 2,000 years. Well, we've got here in the studio tonight Sir Mortimer Wheeler, and I want to ask him what he thinks, what his first impressions are on seeing Tolland Man.
Well, Glyn, I should say that this is the most haunting relic of antiquity that I've ever seen.
And even in those dark ages of broadcasting, programme makers were finding clever ways to bring archaeology to life. The contents of Tolland Man's stomach were so well preserved that it was possible to reconstruct his last meal. But Daniel and Sir Mortimer clearly needed female help when it came to the cooking.
We know roughly what his last meal consisted of. Incidentally, it was eaten about 12 to 24 hours before he died. We know roughly what the proportions are, and we only know very roughly how it was cooked. We've only certain clues as to how it was cooked. The first and foremost thing about it is that there's no trace of meat whatsoever in what was found.
With the reconstruction of Tolland Man's last meal, it was really about trying to put flesh on the bones of archaeology. It's about making what seemed to be quite a strange, at that time, subject very familiar. We all understand cooking and eating. And I think experimental archaeology was very much about making strange things familiar to audiences. That program in itself was very humorous. The very nicely dressed 1960s woman kneeling down by the Neolithic heart to prepare this meal that then everybody hated.
Now, the only thing we've left out of this is a spoonful of fine sand, which Tolland Man had in his. We didn't put that in out of consideration for Glyn and Sir Mortimer. But it's so
go
cleverly
ahead,
done.
Glyn, go ahead.
Is it delicious?
No. Glyn, is anyone looking? To know I've solved this problem?
Have you? How do we solve?
If one could be frivolous in the presence of these solemn relics, I would say that the poor chap of Tolland committed suicide because he could stand his wife's cooking no longer.
Very good. What I say is a little more animal and a little less vegetable.
There's too much vegetable.
There's too much vegetable. And not
no
enough
mineral, no mineral.
Salt or sand. Well,
well.
Anyhow, we'll drink to Tolland Man, if not to this diet.
Bless him.
Skål.
Skål. Good stuff.
Yes, it is. It's much better.
Glyn Daniel and Mortimer Wheeler launched archaeology onto British television, but it took a new channel and its young new controller to secure it a permanent place in the schedules.
Buried Treasure, which was the BBC One series, had come to an end for some reason. And BBC Two then took up that torch and elaborated it and turned it into Chronicle. The next step was to do your own excavation. And what excavation could we support where we could have cameras there over a long period, so that you didn't do this business of finding something, an archaeologist finding something, and then ringing out the BBC and then burying it again, so you could say, what is this? We wanted the real thing. And the obvious thing was Silbury Hill. Silbury Hill, the biggest man-made monument in Western Europe, enormous, very famous, on the main road to go from London to Bristol. And I thought, that's marvellous. We could put BBC 2 OB units, outside broadcast units, alongside, so everybody passing along this main road would see BBC 2, because we were in need of publicity.
Some 3,500 years ago, the great green mound of Silbury Hill in Wiltshire was dazzling white, a huge pile of gleaming chalk standing out like a beacon, the largest man-made prehistoric mound in all Europe, laboriously piled up over what?
One of my first engagements with archaeology as a kid was watching the excavation that went into this mound here, Silbury Hill, and it was broadcast live on my fuzzy little black and white screen at home. And it was an exciting event. It galvanised, I think it's probably not an exaggeration to say, the entire nation in the way that, of course, television doesn't anymore.
The Silbury dig was national news, and it put Chronicle and regular presenter Magnus Magnusson in the spotlight, especially with the whiff of buried treasure in the air.
Local legend has it that it was built over the grave of a certain, or rather of a highly uncertain, King Zell, and that at the heart of the mound there lies a life-size statue of King Zell on horseback in solid gold. Well, as legends go, that's as good an explanation as any. The fact is that we simply do not know yet why this mound was built at such prodigious cost in time and energy.
There were promises of treasure. It was dark and mysterious. We had fuzzy, sort of shaky camera work. We had a spectacular presenter who was very serious. We had a posh archaeologist who seemed to know everything there was to know about archaeology.
Well, I'm going to cut the first turf, and then we're ready to clear the thing open up to a point.
Professor Richard Atkinson, a man of formidable reputation, took charge of the dig, while the controller of BBC 2, David Attenborough, handled the press in London.
Mr. Marsden-Ganser thinks that we might find nothing at all. What then?
We can quite certainly say that we are not going to find nothing at all, because the main object of this operation, like any other archaeological investigation, is to get information.
It isn't a treasure hunt. And if we find, it's possible, we may, a very rich burial at the centre, well, that's simply a bonus.
He may have come over as a bit of a sort of eagle-faced sharpshooter, but in fact he had a mischievous twinkle in his eye. He went along with the idea that somebody was going to have to mention King Zell, all in gold, on his golden horse, because that was the local legend.
The fact is that nobody knows what there is in the centre. Some people, myself included, don't very much care.
But for the archaeologists, the real treasure was a handful of dead snails. This biological evidence helped to establish the mound as over 4,000 years old, before the age of metals, so no chance of a golden statue then.
Of course, if we had found a great sack of gold, or if we had found a mass burial or something, it might have been even more exciting. But that's not what the whole thing is about. The whole thing is about archaeology and how we discover about our past.
The press had got the bit between their teeth. They were determined that it was really going to be about treasure and that we would be disappointed if we didn't find it. And it didn't matter what I said, and I gave lots of press conferences, it didn't matter at all. Everybody said, when in the end the thing finished and we hadn't found a golden horseman, they said, well, see, that was a disappointment. But nothing could have been farther from the truth.
During the digging season, the public flocked to the site. The live broadcasts had put Silbury and BBC 2 on the map. Viewers may not have found out why the mound was constructed, but at least now they knew the when and the how. And for the next 25 years, Chronicle would set the standard for others to follow. Documentaries that travelled the globe to tell the greatest stories from the past.
What I was keen should happen is the Chronicle should establish a network around the world so that they would know, the Chronicle unit would know what discoveries were being made where. So that the first thing that someone excavating in Australia or in South America would say, right, we'd better get onto the Chronicle team because they will send out a unit with cameras and they can film this very important thing that's happening. And therefore, Chronicle would be the touchstone at the centre of this network.
It's very overgrown, I'm afraid. See if I can fight my way through.
We're on our way to the Inca ruins of Choqquequirao, which are perched on a ridge on the far side of the Apurima Canyon behind me. Remote and still extremely difficult to get to, they were discovered at the end of the 18th century, the first large group of Inca ruins to be found in the area called Vilcabamba.
The BBC Features Group had a relationship with Time Life so that it was possible to go for 5 weeks to Guatemala to do a film about the rise and fall of the Maya civilization with Sir Eric Thompson and Magnus.
Considering how little they were, they really went in for steep steps, didn't they? Well, that's true enough. Of course, one reason, you know, they used to send the sacrificial victims down from the top, bump them, let them go down, and they must have gone down with one heck of a bump, you know. Yeah. And the congregation were down below there, and when the body arrived, certain ones had the right to cut him up and take part of the fleshes. It's for kind of communion service.
I don't suppose the victim appreciated it, but it's a marvellous view once you've done the club.
Oh, boy, it certainly is, huh?
Chronicle was also instrumental in developing a new idea in archaeology, reconstructing items from early history. The team built a replica of a skin-covered curragh to see how it was possible to navigate the Irish Sea in the Stone Age. Paul Johnston, who headed up Chronicle, was inspirational in leading others to take an adventure in the past.
Then at last we were ready, or more or less anyway, and at 3:20 in the afternoon we set off. The getaway wasn't perhaps as smart as it should have been, but then I don't suppose it would have been much different in the Stone Age. There was polite applause from the crowd, a toot from the train on the quay, a friendly whiff from the bacon factory, and the crossing had started.
One of the things he did, for example, was everybody knew the story that the stones, some of the stones in Stonehenge, had been brought from the Preseli Mountains in Wales. The question was how. And all kinds of theories were propounded until Paul said, OK, let's try it. So he constructed one of those stones, correct in weight and size and so on, and then got teams of public school boys to try and work out how you could actually, or could not, drag it, how you could or could not float it across rivers and so on.
With it sitting securely on the platform, we set off, punting upriver, with some boys of Bryanston School as crew. Even though they weren't perhaps the most expert punters in the country, we had no trouble moving it upstream. Now, with 24 gallant volunteers from Canford School hauling, off we go. But no, 24 can't do it. Can 28? No, it's still too much for them. Can 32? Yes, they can, and off the sledge goes.
And that kind of thing, which became known as experimental archaeology, when the archaeologists took it up. At first, they said, oh, poof, this is just kind of popularization. But by the 60s and the late 60s, archaeologists were reeling, yes, this is the right way.
Experimental archaeology was one thing that Chronicle really started off, you know, in things like reconstructing costumes and boats and things like that. So I suppose there was a sort of logic to a large-scale experiment like Living in the Past.
Living in the Past was an experiment in reconstructing an ancient way of life. For one entire year, a group of 12 young people and 3 small children first built, then lived and worked on a replica of an ancient British farm, cut off from the modern world. They didn't attempt to become ancient Britons, that was obviously impossible. But for the whole of that year, they wore, or didn't wear, the same kind of clothes, lived in the same kind of buildings, raised the same crops and livestock, and used the same tools, which archaeologists and historians tell us were used more than 2,000 years ago, in the Iron Age.
with those living in programs, it set the stage for programs like Big Brother. It showed you that it was possible to create an artificial scenario for people to live in. You throw them in and you see how they cope, or more properly, how they don't cope. And that makes great television.
I said, well, if she wants to complain about the bloody flowers, she can say it to me if she wants.
Do you think that's true?
Well, that's happened with bacon. I've seen it with bacon.
Well, why shouldn't she have more? I don't eat
yes,
no, but
well,
you can't then turn around and say
you're just fishing in to eat it.
I'm not eating. I mean, I didn't say it. No, I said to you this morning. I said I didn't like meat. I gave up meat up for moral and religious reasons, the same reasons practically as what you gave it up for. And since I've been here, I found it difficult to eat it at first, and I don't mind it because I spent such a long time telling myself this is flesh. I don't want to eat it, and so I came here and had to say this isn't flesh. I've got to start eating it again because there isn't anything else to eat.
The public may have been tuning in to catch the soap opera of Iron Age life, but the programmes were a vivid living experiment for archaeologists like Barry Cunliffe.
Right, fine.
The method we've got to now, I mean, it's got the biggest advantage is that we stick the wheat in a bundle of cloth, stick it up there, and then you just leave it. And there's no worry of it over-parching. You can't over-parch it. There's no worry of it burning. It's just up there when you want it. You just go and take it.
I was invited down right at the end just to see how I responded to going into this alien world, which in theory I knew all about because I'd been digging it up and writing about it. And there was no doubt at all that I came away with a totally different impression than I could have got from my archaeology. I remember particularly going into a hut and sitting down inside a hut and having stew that was being made, and noticing a rather ragged hole just inside the threshold of the hut, in the floor, in the earth floor, a sort of gritty, dusty hole. And I just literally 2 or 3 weeks before that, I'd been excavating an Iron Age hut in the hill fort of Danebury, and several times in several huts I'd found holes rather like this just inside the door. And I suddenly saw this, and I said to one of the guys there, "How did that form?" He said, "Oh, it's the chicken. They just sort of come in and they take a dust bath there, and they like it there because it's not right in the house, but it's warm and there's still sunlight and so on." So suddenly, you know, my eyes were opened. I was understanding my archaeology more, and also going there and seeing suddenly the absence of colour. It was all dun colours. It was all greys and browns and realising the Iron Age world was a world without colour. And that made me appreciate how important polished bronze and red enamel would have been in the Iron Age. And there are lots of ornaments of bronze and enamel. So it opened my eyes enormously. And that was an unforgettable experience to me.
At times, the village seemed more 70s New Age than late Iron Age. In October, the villagers erected a giant wicker man, complete with period flares, to celebrate the Celtic festival of Semaine, which later became Halloween and is now mixed up with Bonfire Night. They were determined to have a proper pagan festival.
Burn him! 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 Burn him!
Over the year, we've felt that there's more and more to celebrate, really. We've been wanting to get the festivals organised in a more elaborate footing because we realised that the more you put into them, the more you'd get out of them.
But Chronicle wasn't above the odd crowd puller. A series of programmes embraced perhaps the most imaginative tosh of the age, courtesy of former Doctor Who scriptwriter Henry Lincoln, real name Henry Soskin. A story that would become one of the sources of a later publishing sensation.
Mystery and drama can sometimes lie hidden in the most tranquil of settings. And the most tantalizing of mysteries are those which speak of hidden treasure. This remote mountaintop village in southern France might well conceal that tantalizing X which marks the spot on a treasure map. Or perhaps it conceals something more.
Everywhere, the church is covered with flamboyant, detailed decoration.
slightly disturbing, slightly uncomfortable, and yet curiously lacking in atmosphere. The church has been sucked dry.
Henry was a friend of mine. I knew him very well, and I haven't seen him for years, but Henry was a good pal. And during the making of The Priest, the Painter and the Devil, which was the Chronicle programme, I would meet him in the evenings, and he was terribly excited with information which had come into his possession. I remember him saying over a pint of Guinness one evening, he said, "It's a tremendous responsibility. If only I could tell you what it is that I know, it would mean the end of Western civilization as we know it."
And the treasure of the Templars has never come to light. The treasure of the Temple of Jerusalem, the treasure of the Visigoths, the treasure of the Templars of Bezu. 3 different treasures, or just one treasure being constantly exploited. But the possibilities are not exhausted yet. No one ever denied that the Templars fought and died valiantly for Christ, and yet one of the accusations made against them at their trial was that they denied Christ and trampled on the cross.
The story of the supposed treasure of Rennes-le-Château gathered Chronicle its largest ever audience. It was popular then, but much more popular since.
It was a wonderful story about, and in fact, we went into very considerable detail about all kinds of religious persecution in France and one thing or another. And that, I suppose I have to be careful what I say legally, whether it's the basis of the Da Vinci Code, I can't say, but certainly it's very like the Da Vinci Code.
And here is the first message.
In Henry Lincoln's programmes, we were introduced to a world of symbols, codes, false trails and buried treasure, all leading to the blinding revelation that Christ had not died on the cross. And his descendants were the Merovingian kings who ruled France in the Dark Ages.
Dagobert was one of the last kings of the Merovingian dynasty of France. He was assassinated in the year 679 AD. It is perhaps not impossible that a Dark Ages royal treasury could be hidden away here. But Zion is Jerusalem.
Even we who worked on the series said, we'll never get away with that. But of course there was an elemental truth in it, and Henry was a consummate storyteller. And it based itself around the one thing which still sells archaeology, which is a mystery. A mystery based on a certain amount of fact and a certain amount of misinterpretation of some facts. But we thought, well, we'll not hear any more of that. And look what happened.
For years, Henry Lincoln returned...
We now know that Western civilization didn't end in the 1970s, though at the time, some people took Henry's word as gospel.
I don't know about gospel. I don't know whose gospel. But yes, of course. But I mean, it was okay. It was made you think about the sources of information about history. Where do you go and look for information? How do you confirm these things? What is true and what is not true, and what is fancy and what is fable? It served a very interesting and valuable point about how you should think about history.
Henry Lincoln aside, Chronicle continued to lead the field throughout the next 2 decades. It pioneered new branches of archaeology by embracing our recent industrial past. One of Chronicle's notable successes sprang out of the decision to send a young producer, Ray Sutcliffe, down to the Falklands to film the SS Great Britain, one of the great monuments of the Age of Iron, as it lay battered by the South Atlantic gales.
Ray came up with the proposal that the very, very first iron ship, powered steamship, was sitting rotting in the Falkland Islands. And wouldn't it be great to bring it back?
In a race against the coming winter storms, the boat was hurriedly prepared for its homeward voyage across 2 oceans.
They had refurbished that deckhouse themselves as somewhere comfortable to eat their breakfast. That was only the small mizzenmast. And that might easily have been a lot worse if somebody had been in the way.
It was a good example of something which started from small beginnings and really became a program of great significance as one of the major contributions that Chronicle made to archaeology, I think.
The greatest triumph of Brunel's most famous ship was its final progress up the Avon Gorge under Brunel's own suspension bridge to its home port in Bristol. The SS Great Britain now has a permanent resting place in the very dock where she was built nearly 150 years ago.
The SS Great Britain was probably one of the happiest accidents of history, not just from television's point of view, but maritime history. If you chose any ship of any century, this would undoubtedly be one, and it was just about in time.
Television was in the process of inventing a new discipline, industrial archaeology.
Up until the 1970s, archaeologists didn't really think that the post-medieval period in general, you know, the period from the 16th century onwards, was really their domain. And the development of sub-disciplines like industrial archaeology is really very new indeed.
Industrial archaeology connected with a generation which had become acutely conscious of the wholesale destruction of much of the manufacturing past.
Inside this bottle-shaped hovel was a huge oven stacked full of tiles. You can see how big it was from this ring of fire pits, and the fires in these went through the oven, firing the tiles, and the smoke went out of the top of the kiln.
What it had, in televisual terms, was mass and scale, and you could walk into it and walk out of it. It wasn't a series of low walls or holes in the ground like other kinds of archaeology. And you could understand process. You could go and see the bits of machinery that did things. And that involved people straight away, I think, with both the recent past and the past of their parents and their grandparents.
Somebody said to us, they said, you never get that bloody wheel going again. He says, as long as we can.
It's the human past that people find fascinating in the industrial archaeology, the way that people had to work in these factories, what they're producing, you know, how this had a great effect on the growth of the British Empire. You know, the human stories are there, and, you know, television helped to tease those out.
And that, I think, came over extremely well in industrial archaeology on television. It was almost as though industrial archaeology was made for television, but television was made for industrial archaeology.
Through television, archaeology spoke directly to the public. The Kennet and Avon Canal, the M4 of its day, had been derelict since 1947. Programmes such as Manscape helped to put its restoration back on the agenda. Neil Cossons was amongst those leading the charge to recognise and preserve the best of the old.
By far the biggest and most spectacular engineering feature on the whole route of the Kennet and Avon is here at Devizes, where the canal had to drop down some 250 feet from the Vale of Pewsey, from the Wiltshire Downs, down into the valley of the River Avon. This drop was achieved in this amazing flight of 29 locks. The restoration of this section, with its massive side ponds, poses formidable problems. Problems that must be overcome if this is to be a living waterway once again.
Advances in technology meant archaeology could continue to take on new and even more daunting projects. In 1972, Chronicle was contacted by a team of divers. They'd set out to find the flagship of Henry VIII's fleet, the Mary Rose.
They said, we'll find this Tudor battleship because, like the Great Britain, it's seminally important. So we said, right, we'll sign a contract, and because we were continually there, we could follow it. And we did. And the very first one was simply what you might call a magazine item. The first things that came up were several teacups from the Isle of Wight ferry, a couple of dinky toys, and one rather battered-looking piece of wood. And everyone said, so you're going to bring up a Tudor battleship? The answer was, yes, provided you can hang on for 10 years.
But, live on TV, the raising of the skeletal remains of the ship turned out to be even more dramatic than planned.
It's going very well. We're lifted off the seabed. The underwater lifting frame is just about 2 metres down beneath the water, and now the pumps which will pump out the water from inside the hull are being placed in position. These are absolutely essential because, of course, one must reduce the level of the water inside the hull to equalise with the level outside. And so this is the last phase before she begins to break the water surface.
When you bring an object up out of the bottom of the ocean and it suddenly comes out into the air, that is a moment of revelation, which of course is hugely exciting and dramatic. One of the problems, of course, is that it also is the moment when it doubles its weight, or whatever the figure is, because instead of being supported by water, suddenly it's out in the air, and the weight is huge, and huge strain is put on the lifting apparatus.
Well, I can see through the window of dive control that the vessel is now rising in the water, and that the massive crane of Togmore is lifting the vessel further.
Colonel Sheedy, what's happened there?
It would look as though the leg on the right, something has given there, and the superstructure has come down, dropped down a certain distance.
And thank goodness it was not a disaster, because in the end it was repaired and came out. And but the size of the thing and the detail in which it was preserved has made it an enormous spectacle. I mean, a wonderful thing to see.
TV archaeology thrived not just on spectacle, but great communicators. And in the late 1970s, it found a new one, Michael Wood, the ideal blend of an academic and an adventurer. With flowing hair and a tightly packed argument, a man born with charisma in his genes.
Well, Michael Wood was a real radical departure for archaeology on television. Although we'd had personalities like Magnus Magnusson and Sir Mortimer Wheeler, Michael Wood didn't have the kind of eccentricity aspect. He was just a very film star handsome, and I think that was able to attract a whole new audience to archaeology. Archaeology wasn't necessarily cranky, it was serious, it was exciting, it was quite glamorous. And Michael Wood's particular appearance and how that fit with the particular places that he went to for his various series breathed a new life into archaeology on television.
He came at the subject matter as an academic. He was confident with his material. And I think that confidence showed in the way that the programmes were made. I remember particularly the one about the Trojan Wars and the Mycenaeans, which I thought was a very, very good series.
At Troy, Michael Wood retraced the steps of the first great archaeologist of them all, Heinrich Schliemann.
Convinced that Homer's Troy must lie deep inside the hill, Schliemann attacked it with sometimes over 100 workmen, armed with the best English pickaxes, wheelbarrows, windlasses, chains and battering rams, to drive a terrific hole into Hissarlik. And this is Schliemann's great trench today, like a bomb site. You can still walk up it right into the heart of the mound without encountering any architectural detail at all. Architectural detail there was, though. He describes a prehistoric building that he found 20 feet deep with 10 feet high walls made of squared blocks of limestone, beautifully smoothed, all of which he destroyed. But searching for a Troy that looked like Homer's Troy, Schliemann pressed on deeper into Hissarlik.
What Michael has to deal with is much bigger problems than a natural history presenter have to deal with. I mean, natural history is going on behind him. I mean, there's this bird of paradise waggling its wings about. There isn't a queen from the ancient Rome sitting behind Michael Wood. Michael Wood has to create all these peoples and create all these situations in words, and he does it extraordinarily skillfully, walking over the sites where there's nothing but rumpled lawn and grass and a few olive trees, and Michael brings to life the columns that once stood there and the people of ancient Greece who once roamed there, and does it with great skill.
On the night before he first set eyes on it, he slept on a wooden bench in a wretched inn pestered by mosquitoes, but oblivious to the discomfort as he contemplated the gigantic figures of the Greek heroes in this memorable place. Heroes who, murdering and murdered, were sacrificed to their inexorable fate.
I remember him sort of sitting, sweating over his texts in his tent at night, you know, and then putting on this great rucksack and trudging out. And a certain amount of acting. But he was very acceptable academically, very acceptable, because he knew what he was doing. And he knew how to be exciting with it. So he was both an archaeologist, historian, and a programme maker. And that is a very, very rare combination. I don't know of any other person who actually straddles that divide.
By a strange coincidence, in a galaxy far, far away, Hollywood was creating a new archetype of the archaeologist adventurer.
Trust me.
Raiders of the Lost Ark had a huge impact. I know myself, I saw the film about 13 times. And it was very much Raiders of the Lost Ark and watching Michael Wood that made me very interested in archaeology. Clearly, for an adolescent girl, there was an aspect of attractive men doing exciting things, and I wanted to be a part of that. But I think much more generally, culturally, it gave a sense that archaeology was an exciting activity to do, and really drove a lot of people to be quite interested, at least to find out about it, to see if that might be something that they'd want to do.
Just as the world was getting turned on to archaeology, Chronicle returned to the dust from whence it came. But in 1991, a dynamic upstart came to replace it.
It was quite a bombshell, really, that something like archaeology could have been packaged in such an imaginative way and presented as entertainment, and that it was very popular and it was very successful. I mean, it's, extraordinarily good idea, and the fact that it's lasted for 15 series now obviously is testament to the fact that it was a good idea.
Now it's hard to remember that Time Team's format of only 3 days to reveal the past opened it up to a great deal of hostility. You could say that it was in for a dig.
Time Team is an interesting phenomenon. There is a sort of love-hate relationship with it, I think, that most archaeologists have. It became straitjacketed into this silly business of rushing around fields and waving your arms up and down and doing it all in 3 days. I can see why, from a television point of view, and it creates attention, and there has to be something at the end. But that perverted the archaeological content, in my opinion.
You got my Roman road?
No.
No. So throughout this entire long trench, there's no road?
No, nothing.
That's where the line from the map evidence said that the road should be.
And it isn't?
You know, people say that it's not being done properly. Well, I mean, I've been involved in Time Team digs and lots of other digs as well, and it simply isn't the case that it's not being done properly on Time Team. These are like regular archaeological evaluations, as we call them, where you don't know much about an archaeological site, possibly there's going to be some kind of development, you go in and you do some preliminary investigation to find out if there's archaeology there and what needs to be done before the development goes ahead.
No. So does that mean that we need to dig a trench in the middle of the football pitch?
I'd like to do that because we've definitely got a clear radar response there. I said it was confused here. Nothing clear at all.
But have we got enough evidence to dig up someone's football pitch?
Well, I must admit I'm getting a bit more worried, but there is an alternative approach. We could actually put a borehole into our anomaly and a borehole to the side, and if we can see the difference then we can make a decision whether it's worth destroying the pitch.
We have always insisted that above all, the programme has got to be good archaeology. It doesn't mean the programme itself is archaeology, but the archaeology we record has to be superb, because we're being scrutinised all the time. And of course occasionally we make a mistake, we're human beings, but our archaeologists have got the bottle to do that on camera.
It was Time Team that showed just how widespread the use of modern technology had become in archaeology. Not so much now, dig, 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 as geophys, geophys, geophys.
John and the rest of his team, and this is a first for Time Team, are going to try some underwater geophys. What exactly are they going to do, Stuart?
Well, they're using ground-penetrating radar to see if they can find whether there's a ford across the river, that's stone slabs laid, or whether there remains of a bridge, the bridge piers which would have supported the road over the river. The radar they're using, actually, it will penetrate the bottom of the boat, it'll go through the water and hopefully pick up any mass of stone below.
When Glendaniel and Mortimer were making their programmes, you had to dig for a hell of a long time before you found most of the stuff that you were looking for. Geophysics turned that on its head. Not that it was new technology, most of it was the technology that was around in the Second World War and helped us discover the U-boats, but the chip and the PC meant that suddenly you could read what was under a landscape and immediately plug into your own laptop in the back of a van, and you would get the results there and then.
Science was also the key to BBC's Meet the Ancestors. The programme used the very latest forensic techniques to reveal how our ancestors lived and how they died.
I thought Meet the Ancestors was a very good format indeed. I think it had its limitations in that you had that exclusive, or more or less exclusive, focus on human remains.
The lid's got to come off. I mean, this isn't as it was planned, taking the lid off now, but nonetheless it's a really exciting moment, because soon, I think when this piece comes off, we're going to get an idea as to whether there's actually anybody inside or not. Now, if you're going to do a series about people, what's the best lead into doing it? The best lead into my mind was to look at the human remains, to look at the skeletons, because the physical remains of those people, and then see what you could actually build on those, using all the techniques of investigation, dating, forensic science and things like that.
Jaw, isn't it?
Is that the jaw?
There's an eye, I think.
Oh, so that's the upper jaw there. That's right. Well, I think that's resolved one question anyway. It does look as if it's occupied.
Julian Richards, the series' resident archaeologist, dealt exclusively with the skeletal remains of existing excavations.
Criticism could have been levelled that I was actually digging up bodies to make television programmes, which would have actually been the case. We'd have gone to dig up a body to make a story. So that's why I wanted to go to excavations that were actually taking place.
In recent years, we've become more sensitive to the digging up of dead people. In Mortimer Wheeler's day, there were fewer such scruples.
If you dig up a man with bulls and things all around him, like those people we dug up at the east end of Maiden Castle, they were dead. They'd been dead a long time, and they were going to be dead a long time. They're still dead. But around them were all sorts of possessions, which were of interest to us. They helped us to put a little piece of our history into perspective, which we otherwise wouldn't have had, and so on. They enable us to reconstruct the world and the history within which we live. And I think that's worthwhile. We do no harm to these poor chaps. When I'm dead, you can dig me up 10 times for all I care. I won't haunt you much.
Like Tolland Man 40 years before, Meet the Ancestors took us back in time. In a vivid reveal at the end of the programme, we would come face to face with an ancestor.
Can we have a look at the Roman then? I'm really looking forward to seeing what he looks like.
Yes, of course. Okay, so there's a small animation showing the 3D reconstructed soft tissue with the image now mapped on top of it.
He suddenly looks incredibly human. I suppose the last time I saw him was Robin's reconstruction, where it was a very strange colour, but somehow all the flesh tones and everything just make him look like a person, don't they?
That's right.
It certainly helped to bring that person to life, because otherwise you had an abstract series of bits of information. You know, you knew their height, you knew their weight, you know that it was a male, that they had arthritis, that they'd lived at this particular period of time. But what the face was something to hang all that information on and say to people, look, this is that person. And what I was pleased about was that we actually spent the time and money to do proper forensic facial reconstructions, rather than sort of, well, here's an artist's impression of what this person might have looked like. It was as close to the real thing as science would allow us to get.
At the turn of the new millennium, archaeology had something of a crisis of confidence. It started to dig up its own past.
I have not.
In 2001, Surviving the Iron Age revisited an old format. Its 1970s ancestor had been a valid search for knowledge and a prototype for reality television. The new version was a clone. For decades, archaeology had innovated. Now, it imitated. If you were in any doubt we'd arrived in the Big Brother age, here are a few clues.
Day 3, and Yasmin is up, but no happier. But as day 4 dawns, food is the last thing on anyone's mind.
Just when we think we know what we're going to do for the day, they throw something else at us. Look at this lot. We've got to call them all in from the fields now.
The format struggled from the very beginning. There were Iron Age taps, a producer with a mobile phone.
Happy to fit in wherever we can, but we have to look after ourselves.
What's that? What's that?
It's a bird.
Martin, your dream.
Thank you. Bye.
And a visit to the pub.
How do you know what that?
Clearly those people weren't living in the Iron Age, because otherwise they would have been able to deal with the lack of running water, the lack of electricity, the lack of refrigeration facilities in a way that they weren't able to do.
I remember being taken there to take part in the, I think, penultimate one. It had all the fascination for me of the first one, where one understood how people were living, but they were far more individuals and encouraged to be more individual and encouraged to be more quirky, I think. There was also health and safety at work, which meant you couldn't do half the things you could in the earlier programmes.
As soon as the project started, it nearly came to a vomiting halt.
But tonight, Bill's chickens will come close to stopping the project in its tracks.
We're cooking flowers.
Oh, that's not cooked, is it?
Has anybody told them? A few people haven't been very well overnight, so we may have a bit of a crisis on our hands today.
How are we today?
Not too bright. Everyone's ill, apparently.
My trousers were soaking and I pooed my trousers. I'd just been to the toilet about 15 times overnight. It's just like water coming out.
It was car crash television. I mean, I used to watch it because it was hysterically funny to see what they got wrong the next week. And one got the feeling, cynically, that that's why it had been put together, because people were going to fail in a spectacular way.
I wiped myself with stinging nettles first.
Oh, no.
Oh, no, because I couldn't see. It was pitch black. I'm just grabbing anything.
The two programmes were very different, and I think, frankly, the second one didn't work, whereas the first series really did work.
In 2003, in the quest for the perfect format, archaeology was marketed as a breathless rush to find treasure.
I think we've got to find over here.
Gone was the idea of painstaking inquiry. Hidden treasure simply got in the metal detectors.
I soon got into the swing of things, and within seconds I had a signal.
I think just there.
And the expert archaeologist was swapped for someone who seemed never to have held a trowel before.
Oh, hang on, it's not my ring, is it? I'm such an amateur.
If that wasn't exciting enough, try extreme archaeology.
All over Britain, there are archaeological sites that are too dangerous to access or excavate. They could contain unique and valuable evidence of our past, which, if not investigated, will be lost forever.
Archaeology was presented as a dangerous activity where life, limb and credibility were all under threat.
The tunnels are potentially lethal, and the threat of collapse is never far away.
Well, I thought this was solid rock.
My benchmark for things like that is I sit and watch it with my son, who at the time that came out must have been about 13 and very interested in extreme sports. You know, we sat and watched it, you know, extreme archaeology, you know, how to get him interested in archaeology. And we sat and watched it, and he sort of said halfway through, this isn't really very extreme at all, is it?
That takes us 25 feet up to a platform there, and beyond that it's virgin territory. So we're hoping we're going to find something good up there.
Yeah, here's hoping.
So the sooner we can get a move on and get up this ladder and into the stuff we want to be into, the better.
That was unbelievable. It was so awful. It was determined entirely by a format, and there was nothing really about archaeology in it at all. It's almost as though the word archaeology is being kept because it's got some credibility.
Talking about credibility, on the back of Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code, Henry Lincoln's weird story of the Holy Grail was dug up again. But did we get an archaeologist to see if any evidence matched the story? Well, yes and no, or more precisely, no. We got Clarkson's mate, the nice cuddly one, Richard Hammond, who clearly set out more to entertain than inform.
Heads or tails? So, heads west, tails north. Well, I shan't be needing my sun cream. I'm going north.
The use of celebrities, as they say, from one field and to introduce and present subjects quite other than one they're known about has some justification, because what it can do is that celebrity can draw in the people from the pop world or whatever it is to look at archaeology or natural history or any other subject who wouldn't normally look in that way. So that's a way of a valuable thing to do, and perfectly valid, I think.
From its earliest beginnings, TV archaeology has never been afraid to use showmanship to add zip to a good story. But at its best, the main role of television archaeology will always be to reveal new evidence, fascinating us and connecting us to our ancestors.
After being buried for nearly 2,000 years, only now is this lost city being unearthed. Cocooned for centuries beneath volcanic debris, Herculaneum grows more and more unstable as it's uncovered. After years of neglect, the team raced to conserve the site before the town's priceless artifacts are lost forever.
Wooden beams are some of the really rare features of this site. And it's not just wood. All sorts of organic materials survive. Here, for instance, you have a wicker basket, perhaps for fishing, we don't know quite what. And here, one of the really astonishing finds from the site, a Roman loaf. A Roman loaf divided it into its little slices of bread, which actually has the name of the guy who was going to consume it stamped on it. You can see an A or a V and an M there. And what you did was you put your name on so you get the right loaf back out of the oven.
Archaeology tells the greatest story that there is, the story of mankind, the story of mankind's frustrations, perils and achievements. And what greater story is there?
Creating drama from primary historical sources next tonight on BBC4 with Casualty 1907.